Before we begin, if you enjoy dark science fantasy, immersive world building, and narrated stories, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps support the series and ensures you don't miss the next chapter of Empire of Ash and Seamlight. You are listening to Empire of Ash and Seamlight, Book 1, Echoes of Eternal, written by Jerry Buford. Prologue. The world did not simply end. It was harvested, not by wrath, not by plague, not by any ancient king of flesh and tyranny marching beneath banners of iron and ash. No trumpet of judgment sounded, no liturgical choir rose to name the hour. No final host stood upon a last wall and cast its defiance into the black. Instead, the ending came as process. A vast and patient unmaking descended upon the world with the cold precision of a sanctified engine set at last into motion after an age of silence. Reality did not erupt. It was taken apart, layer by layer, measure by measure. As a great tapestry, older than empires and heavier than memory, might be drawn through adamantine teeth and rendered down to loose thread and dust. What had once been whole was not shattered in rage, but reduced in sequence. Mountain, sea, citadel, bone, name, fire, breath. All of it passed beneath that unseen mechanism and emerged, lesser, thinner, emptied of rightful form. There had been heat, aye, but not the wild heat of cleansing flame. It was the smothered, ironclad heat of exertion, the furnace breath of impossible labor. The globe itself had groaned beneath it. Continents had labored against their own foundations. Oceans had quivered in their basins like metal in a mold. Cities had bent inward with the slow obedience of wax pressed beneath a giant's thumb. Then, when the labor was complete, stillness came. Not peace, stillness. The seas lay dead beneath a bruised heaven, broad and leaden, and without the old fury of tide. They did not heave, they did not whisper. They spread from horizon to horizon like hammered plates of tarnished silver, reflecting only a sky diseased with violet gloom. Over them hung a pall of cinder cloud and ash, so thick that light itself seemed burdened by it. Day had not wholly perished, but it had grown infirm. It limped across the firmament in a dim and bloodless haze, as if the sun beyond the murk had been wrapped in funerary cloth. The mountains remained, yet only in mockery of their former majesty. Their crowns had been torn away. Their ridgelines stood jagged and black against the smoldering half-light, like the broken teeth of a behemoth buried beneath the crust of the earth. Once they had borne snow, storm, and eagle shadow. Now they bore only silence and the long fall of ash. Great scarps of obsidian glass and vitrified stone shone where old granite had been melted and forced to cool in unnatural plains. Ravines yawned where whole faces of the range had simply sloughed away, revealing depths that glimmered faintly with residual heat. Forests had become grave fields. There were trunks still standing in places, thousands upon thousands of them, yet no leaf remained, nor sap, nor living fiber. They rose pale and stripped from the blackened soil like the ribs of something titanic and long dead. Their bark had been scoured away. Their marrow had been boiled out. They stood in clusters of white ruin, casting thin spectral shadows through the smoke-hung twilight. Wind passed through them only rarely, and when it did, they gave no rustle of branch or canopy. They answered with a dry, minute clicking, a sound so small against the immensity of the waste that it seemed less a voice than the memory of one. The air was thick enough to feel upon the skin. Had lungs remained to draw it deeply, they would have labored for the privilege. It hung low and heavy, rich with the smell of ozone, scorched ore, cooling slag, and the bitter tang of something stranger still. Some sharp metallic savor that set itself at the back of the throat like a warning not meant for mortal flesh. Each draft of it would have seemed to weigh more than the last. Gravity itself felt altered there, as though the world had grown reluctant to release anything upward again. Ash did not flutter so much as descend with grave deliberation. Smoke did not rise with freedom. It coiled and dragged, pressed down by an unseen hand. and beneath all things there persisted a sound, low, endless, subsonic, and immense. It was not heard so much as born. It moved through the bedrock, through the hollowed shells of towers, through the dead oceans and the glassed plains and the fused wreckage of all that had once called itself civilization. It was the deep, iron murmur of a world that had been made to suffer a correction too great for its frame. A grinding resonance, a buried vox shriek dragged down beyond the pitch of ordinary hearing until it became a pressure in the teeth, a tremor in the marrow, a liturgical drone muttered by the planet to itself because there remained none else to hear confession. The cities were gone, yet not wholly gone. Their shapes still marred the land in places vast and terrible in their ruin. Towers of alloy and blackened stone had folded inward under impossible force, pancaked into obscene strata of metal, glass, carbon, and bone-fine dust. Elevated transit lines had sagged and broken like waxen threads. Causeways ended in abrupt plunges into molten chasms or rose halfway from the earth before vanishing into fused embankments of slag. Cathedrals of trade and industry, manufactories, habitation spires, military bastions, data vaults, sanctuaries, all had been laid down together in one equal sentence of annihilation. No corpses marked the avenues, no bones whitened the plazas, no final barricades, no mass graves, no butcher fields of the conquered remained to testify. That was the truest obscenity of it. The world bore wounds beyond counting, yet almost nowhere did it bear the familiar evidence of struggle. Life had not been cut down where it stood. It had not been left to rot in heaps beneath a pitiless sky. It had been taken, disassembled, rendered, converted into uses no witness remained to name. The absence of the dead was more dreadful than their presence could ever have been. It hollowed the eye. It mocked the heart. It made every ruined street and sanctified hall seem less like a battlefield than a workshop abandoned after the completion of some abominable labor. Far beneath the crust, tectonic plates still muttered against one another in uneven rhythm. The world's old balance had been maimed. Its heart no longer turned as it once had. The deep core labored out of true, as if some invisible hand had laid hold of the axis itself and twisted it half a degree toward madness. From that internal wound arose strange tides in the stone. Gravity pooled where it should not. Pressure wandered. In some places, pebbles drifted a finger's breadth above the ground before settling once more. In others, the world clung hungrily to all weight set upon it, so that each imagined footstep would have felt as though one walked not merely upon a planet, but through the downward regard of a buried god. Above, the heavens fared little better. The upper dark was scored with wounds too broad for mortal sight to rightly apprehend. Great fractures in the unseen order of distance lingered there, faint as old scars and yet more catastrophic than any storm front. They did not blaze. They did not move with the stately passage of comets or the ordained procession of stars. They hung in the void as distortions, subtle until stared at, then impossible not to behold. Places where the black between worlds had been pinched, folded, and drawn taut by a passage that had not respected any natural law of travel. They were not gates, they were not signs, they were residue, the marks left by something so vast in operation that space had ceased to be road and become merely material. Across the gulf between systems, those scars continued to propagate, not swiftly, and not with any visible splendor. There were no herald flares to announce them, no celestial pageantry. The damage traveled in silence, passing through the seams between dimensions like a sickness in hidden blood. Somewhere in the black, instruments unborn to this dead world would one day register those impossible harmonics. Somewhere, scholars, strategists, priests, and tyrants would gather beneath their lamps and hollow screens and sanctified sigils and discover that the mathematics no longer balanced, that old certainties had soured, that the universe, without seeking permission of any species within it, had acquired a new and dreadful behavior. This world had been among the first, not the first ever perhaps, but among the first whose bones remained in such hideous completeness that the lesson could still be read in them. Then, in that leaden stillness, something moved. Not in the sky, not among the dead towers, beneath, deep within the broken integument of the planet, where crust had split and old fire had been pressed into unfamiliar obedience, a pressure gathered with glacial patience. The glassed plains trembled, not violently, not enough to crack apart the great sheets of obsidian that armored the earth. Rather, the tremor passed through them as a shiver through a blade newly quenched. Ash danced, pebbles skipped once and fell still. A buried resonance climbed by a single note, and the note was wrong. A seam in the earth began to open. It did not gape all at once. That would have been almost merciful. Instead, the crust separated by increments, each movement attended by a grinding shriek of stone upon stone, iron upon iron, such that the very air seemed flensed by it. The edges of the rupture glowed dimly from within, not with the red of ordinary magma, but with a pallid and malignant luminescence, white sunk deep toward blue, as if some sanctified furnace had been corrupted and taught to burn with the light of winter stars. The fissure widened. Rock plates buckled, vitrified ridges split and toppled inward, falling into a depth that gave no echo back. Then the thing beneath the world made its ascent. It did not emerge like beast, serpent, or man. No old myth had prepared a shape for this. At first it seemed only a rising mass, a black geometry forcing itself upward through the planet's broken skin. Vast plains of obsidian sheen angled against one another at impossible degrees, grinding free of the crust amid cascades of shattered stone and rivers of molten ore. Whole escarpments sloughed from its flanks as it rose. Its motion was slow, but there was no weakness in that slowness. It bore the terrible confidence of a mechanism so immense that haste had become irrelevant to it. More of it came into view. Spines, perhaps, or pylons, or limbs only in the most sacrilegious sense. They unfolded with the deliberate precision of an engine testing joints that had not yet learned the limits of local gravity. Each one was the size of a fortress wall, faceted and black, edged in seams of dim radiance. They pressed into the waist around the rupture and sank deep, not from weight alone, but from authority, as if the ground itself recognized a superior claim and yielded. The main body followed. It was mountain-sized, and yet mountain was too simple a word. A mountain belonged to the world. This did not. It rose from the breach like a citadel conceived by no terrestrial architect. All ironclad angles, obsidian masses, and abyssal hollows where no hollows ought to be. It bore no symmetry the human eye could love, yet neither was it chaos. It was arranged, calculated, terribly coherent in a fashion that made ordinary stone and steel seem provincial. Along its flanks coursed lines of pale force, hair-thin at first, then brighter, until they ran in branching filaments from height to depth like veins of imprisoned lightning. They gave off no warmth. Rather, the nearer they shone, the more the surrounding air seemed to wither into cold. Frost flowered across still hot slag. Vapor condensed in sudden veils and shattered into glittering rime. The smell of ozone sharpened until it bordered pain. Then the thing paused, not as an animal pauses to scent the wind, as an instrument pauses between measurements. It stood in its titanic incompletion above the rent earth while ash drifted down across its black surfaces and vanished against them. It had no face, nothing that could be called a head in honest speech. Yet there was upon its foremost mass a region of such profound dark that the eye recoiled from it instinctively, for it seemed less a surface than an absence cut into the world, a wound in shape itself. Around that negative aperture, the faint white lines converged, sank inward, and were lost. The dead plane answered. Loose iron screamed toward it, skittering across the glassed ground in shrill showers of sparks. Splintered girders tore themselves from the ruins of a half-buried transit yard and bent, inch by inch, until they pointed toward the behemoth's center. Dust rose in spirals. Chunks of vitrified stone slid, halted, then dragged themselves another handspan nearer. Gravity, ancient servant of stars and planets, was being rebuked and rewritten in the presence of that ascension. Still, it did not hurry. Its outer masses shifted by degrees. A pylon angled. A slab-like extension drew upward and outward. A new seam of light appeared along a previously seamless plane, then spread, tracing hidden architecture beneath the obsidian hide. The motion bore no wrath, no exultation, only adjustment, calibration. The giant thing was not announcing itself to the world. It was learning how to inhabit it. Where its radiance touched the land, matter surrendered form. A ridge of cooling slag at the edge of the fissure began to tremble. Hairline fractures raced across its surface with frantic speed. The whole formation then simply loosened, each particle drawing apart from its fellows as though some covenant of cohesion had been quietly revoked. What had been solid a heartbeat before became a dark stream of granular ruin and flowed, without wind, without slope, toward the towering black geometry. It reached the thing's base and vanished into the labyrinth of angles there, absorbed not with the hunger of an animal, but with the smooth inevitability of tribute entering a vault. The process repeated: stone, metal, glass. The world was being taught again that it was raw material. Above the Titan, the sky began to alter. Clouds dragged inward from every quarter, though no weather moved them. The cinder pall, which had for long ages lain broad and motionless over the wounded planet, now twisted into a vast and slow gyration centered above the rupture. The heavens became a wheeling vault of bruise purple and ash black. Pale discharges, silent as withheld breath, flickered between the turning masses. Not lightning, something purer and more obscene. Seamlight, though none lived here yet to give it name. Its reflection moved across the Dead Sea in long, trembling bands. The behemoth tilted one colossal plane toward that false firmament, as though attending to a liturgy intoned from beyond sight. Then it extended itself further into the world. More pylons drove downward and outward. They pierced the crust with the steadiness of cathedral spires descending in reverse, pinning geometry to geology. The glass planes cracked in radial webs that ran for miles. Mountains in the distance answered with landslides, their broken flanks giving way in thunderous curtains of stone. Deep beneath the ground, trapped pressures shifted. Vents burst open. White vapor and metallic dust roared into the sickly air. At last, sound returned to the world in full. Grinding iron, splitting rock, the basso groan of tectonic burden. The hiss of flash frost blooming across hot mineral. The thin, unceasing vox shriek of stressed matter being compelled to exist in a manner contrary to all rightful design. It was not battle, it was installation. The giant thing's internal lights brightened. The black surfaces around them seemed to drink the dimness of the world and grow darker still, until the contrast between radiance and obsidian became almost sacramental in its intensity. Pale force against utter negation, sanctified brilliance devoured by a body made to contain and exploit it. The aperture at its fore deepened. Space around it appeared to bend, not dramatically, not with theatrical violence, but with the quiet and intolerable certainty of truth revealed. Distance shortened around it. Perspective failed. The nearest ruins seemed for a moment to lurch closer without moving at all. A whole avenue of collapsed towers a mile distant sheared loose from the ground and slid toward the breach in stately silence, as if the world had become a tilted board and that abyssal thing its central weight. Still, there was no triumph in it, no malice the heart could recognize. That was the final desecration. Had the dead world been devoured by a creature of rage, then rage might have been named in return. Had some conqueror stood above the bones of nations, then hatred could have taken shape against him. But this was beyond hatred, beyond insult. The thing was not cruel. Cruelty required attention. It simply enacted its nature, and that nature rendered civilizations into feedstock, atmospheres into byproduct, worlds into exhausted husks. At length, the motion slowed, not because the process was ended, but because a threshold had been crossed. The behemoth had established itself. The rupture below it ceased widening. The spiraling sky stabilized into a permanent gyre. The roaming convulsions of the waste diminished until only the deep tectonic murmur remained. Across the black geometry of the Titan's frame, pale seams pulsed in a rhythm too measured to be called random and too alien to be called alive. It stood there, half citadel, half engine, holy blasphemy, larger than any monument the dead world had ever raised in pride, and around it lay the plain in absolute submission. The planet had not survived its visitation. It had been translated, made from world into warning. And somewhere in the dark between stars, beyond the sight of this broken sphere, the same process was already moving onward, along hidden folds in reality, across light years and epochs, through the silent gulfs where younger peoples still dreamed themselves secure. The harvested world endured only as evidence, a dead liturgy written in ash, obsidian, pressure, and scar, proof that when the thing came, it did not conquer, it processed. And when it had finished, it did not gloat, it simply continued. This is only the beginning. Thank you for listening to the prologue of Empire of Ash and Seamlight. If you want to continue the journey when Chapter 1 arrives, like the video and subscribe to the channel.